Thank you for joining us today. My name. Hello, everyone, and everyone who's joined us today. My name is Ivy Anderson, and okay. Hello, and welcome. Welcome to everybody who's joining us today from across the country. My name is Ivy Anderson, and I have the privilege of facilitating this courageous conversation today and shining a light on racism in medical education. This session is being held on behalf of the College of Family Physicians of Canada's section of teachers. As we begin, it's really important to start this conversation thinking about and reflecting on the land on which we live, of the original people who experienced colonization in this country and the injustices they've endured. Together, addressing the systemic racism of Indigenous peoples is part of the collective work we must participate in as we address the injustices faced by all Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So with that, this is our CFPC land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the lands on which we are hosting this webinar today include the traditional territories of many nations. The CFPC recognizes the many injustices faced and experienced by Indigenous peoples of what we now call Canada, and continue to affect their health and well-being. The CFPC respects that Indigenous people have rich cultural and traditional practices that have been known to improve health outcomes. I invite all attendees to reflect on the territories of which you are calling in from as we commit ourselves to gaining knowledge, forging a new culturally safe relationship, and contributing to reconciliation. Next slide, Brian. So let's just start with a little bit of housekeeping. So this particular live chat is being done by Facebook as well as with YouTube. And to participate, we would like you to participate actively in the live chat. So please log in to your YouTube or Google account. Please use your YouTube live chat to participate or ask questions. We will be summarizing the questions at the end of the hour. And then we'll be providing a summary in writing to everybody who also has participated in this as well. Okay. The live webinar has been certified by the CFPC and is for 1 main pro credit. If you could please, we're asking you to please complete your evaluation survey at the end. And also, if you see this as a recorded live stream, you're eligible for non-certified credits in the self-learning category for main pro. Okay, so actively participate as you can. Next slide, Brian. So as your facilitator for this conversation with our 3 presenters, we must declare any conflicts of interest. And with that, other than myself, who is a grateful paid employee of the CFPC, none of our presenters have any conflicts of interest to disclose. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about framing the day or the hour. And some contextual framing descriptors for the session. Our learning objectives are listed here. We really just want to start this conversation on racism in medical education. I think what will end up happening is that after this hour, there's going to be more questions. There's going to be more want to actually converse more. And so we'd love to hear your thoughts about that. You want to share practical strategies to address microaggression, bias, and racism in the teaching setting, and then consider opportunities for being an ally or upstander in your teaching practice. We recognize then that we've got 3 amazing speakers. So I'm going to ask you, Brian, to turn off. Thank you very much. And with that in mind, say hello, friends. Hello.
Hello.
As we talked about on Monday when we prepped for this call, we're going to pretend that nobody's out there. So we are just girls having a conversation, medical teachers, professionals. We are here to have a coffee chat. Reminding you again, feel free to interrupt each other as we would if we were having a coffee chat. Raise your hand if you want to try to get in, and I will try to get you into the conversation if you like, and if I can help with that. And then at the end, we'll do a bit of a summary, okay? And there'll be a few questions that I might ask along the way. So Sarah, could you introduce yourself and share what excited you most about the invitation to have this conversation with us today?
Thank you, Ivy. So I'm Sarah Funnell. I'm a First Nations family physician and public health specialist. My background is Algonquin in Tuscarora, but I grew up on with the Mississaugas. So I'm actually on Alderville First Nation right now, which is in Ontario near right on Rice Lake. So behind me you can see Rice Lake. And I grew up here with the Ojibwe people. And this lake behind me used to grow wild rice. It's part of the Trent Severn waterway system, which was flooded to support boat travel, and rice no longer grows in this lake. And I share that with you because some of the policies that we see, most of the policies that we see, are really centered around whiteness. And so I think what I'm most excited about is actually learning from my co-panelists about their experience with race in our country. Our stories and discussion evoke strong and painful emotion, which we experienced on our dry run earlier this week. But it's really important to know that these painful emotions, this discomfort, is part of the learning process, the learning journey from becoming anti-racist. So physicians, we need to be held to a higher standard. It's not enough to just not be racist. We must be anti-racist. Indigenous people, we've always known what we need to be well. Think about if our healthcare system was developed by Indigenous women, what would it look like? It would look different than what you see today. So I look forward to hearing from my panelists, from Ivy, and just starting this discussion today. We're on a journey. The CFPC is on a journey towards anti-racism, and this is the first step. And if you do feel uncomfortable, if you do feel those strong emotions, I encourage you to reflect on them, talk to somebody about them, and start the discussion with your friends and your colleagues and your family. Chimi Gwitch, Ivy.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So I'm going to invite MA. Can I ask you to introduce yourself as well?
So hi, everyone. My name is Amy Buka. I'm a second-year resident at University of Calgary in family medicine. I'm also the vice chair for the section resident for CFPC. I'm a second-generation Canadian. My parents are originally from Togo. It's a small country between Ghana and Benin, West Africa. I'm also the partner of an Indigenous man, so I also have Afro-Indigenous children, 3 of them. They're wonderful. For me, discussing racism is kind of a daily occurrence. There's not a single day that goes by that I don't think about race. It's part of our daily experiences. As a second generation Canadian, my experiences around race may be different than my parents from who came to Canada as adults, growing up in that context of what we call code switching, trying to adapt to our environments that was mostly around whiteness, was challenging growing up. And as we start these discussions in broader society, but specifically medicine, I can't help but to reflect on all of my previous experiences and how I'm educating my children around race. So my biggest excitement about this conversation is the future outcome that we'll see from it. I'm hoping that it will open a broader discussion around systemic racism within the CFPC and within departments of family medicine. I think that having a very casual conversation is a very nice way to start this, but we have to have the end goal in mind. And the end goal in mind is to acknowledge these structural inequalities within our own systems and working really hard to dismantle them.
Thanks, Amy. And Amy, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Tan. I am an associate professor at the University of Calgary. And I have been going through and humbled to be part of this panel. And it's been interesting in this last 6 months how much has been going on with regards to my reflection about race, which actually started with a lot of increase in anti-Asian racism starting in January with COVID-19, and then with the racial reckoning that we are going through right now after the death of George Floyd, and having ongoing conversations with my parents. So I'm a second generation Canadian as well. My parents left as young adults after high school, Hong Kong, and actually what has been happening in Hong Kong is actually what they were fearful of. And so 50 years later, they are grateful to be Canadians, but yet are still othered as 50, having lived in Canada for 50 years and been Canadians for almost 50 years and having raised a family in Canada. It's been interesting to have those conversations with my parents and see the cultural clashes of my childhood growing up in Richmond, BC in a different light. And has really made me critically examine my childhood experiences with race and racism, and then also realizing and reflecting on the fact that we do live in a country that, while has always embraced diversity, really that has not done anything to help with anti-racist structures, and we need to be supporting Black and Indigenous Canadians as well as people of color with true inclusion and belonging. So I'm thrilled to be part of this conversation, and I'm thrilled that it seems like for the first time in my 16 years since I've been in practice that we're actually having this conversation openly. It's cathartic and it's a relief, but at the same time, as my co-panelists have said, it is uncomfortable as well. And so hoping that this is the start of an ongoing conversation for all of us at the CFPC.
Thanks. So, on Monday, we were talking and we were prepping for this call, and I was sharing out how I was very nervous, just really nervous about having this conversation. One, because I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to say something wrong, right? I'm going to say something wrong. But then what you all said to me was, but it's not about being wrong. It's about reflecting and learning. And it's about not, and for us as medical teachers, it's not about the 3-hour workshop that you have on anti-racism. It's about the ongoing conversation. I don't think it's a surprise, and everybody watching will see that we are all members of BIPOC. And I just wanted you to reflect upon one. What do you think about that? We're having this conversation with a Black physician, an Indigenous physician, an Asian physician. So what do you think about that and the roles that we have, but the roles of those who are white in racism in medical education? Opening it up.
I think it's amazing, first of all. I think it's great representation to be able to do this. What I think is important to acknowledge is that the concept of BIPOC is not a monolith. We're not all the same. We don't have the same experiences. And we talked about on Monday about a bit of the hierarchy around racism and how we can experience racism, but also be perpetrators of racism. And that's something that we have to acknowledge. So when we think of BIPOC, it's not just a simple lump sum group that we discuss. Indigenous peoples have had a specific history of racism and colonialism on their own land here in Canada. People who are immigrants, who have ancestry or ancestors who came to Canada, but later on have different experiences. We also know that there's concept around colonialism. So the concept of people within the same race of different skin colors and experiencing discrimination or bias in their own communities. So the fact that we are quite well represented is not only amazing, but it's going to add a bit of nuance in how we perceive racism within medical education.
Right. Sarah?
MA, I know we didn't talk about this earlier in the week, but I wanted to say how impressed I was that you were able to reflect and recognize moments when you said you've been racist, and I've reflected on an experience I had working in Iqaluit, and I had a certain encounter that made me feel afterwards that really yucky feeling. How do you describe that? How do you unpack it? It took me a really long time, months, to realize that what I was left feeling was this feeling of not being culturally safe when I was with a particular patient. And I think it's really important that we recognize, even though we're BIPOC, that we too can inflict unsafe healthcare situations. And when I heard you speak earlier in the week about how it's important to recognize within ourselves that we can be racist as well, it made me reflect on our favorite book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I was so surprised when he opened up the book talking about how he was racist, and how the author describes that. And so I just wanted to share that with you, MA, that I really appreciate how you're able to tell us about that. It's painful to recognize that we have faults, and to work through them is really important. And it's that reflection piece that's so critical. So Chimigwich for that.
Thank you. Sarah, just to bounce back on what you just mentioned, and I wanted to clarify for our listeners why we're all racist. It's because we are raised in a society that is racist. Our medical education that we receive it in the context of whiteness. That therefore, when we encounter people of different races, indigenous individuals, people who are Black or people of color, our medical process, our critical thinking is still influenced by the lens of whiteness because of the environment in which we were educated, in which we grew up. And that's completely natural. So that means that I may have bias against people who are of my own race. I may have bias towards people who are other people of color or also indigenous people because of our medical education. And I think that's very important to clarify that yes, we all have biases, but the reason why these biases converge towards the same people and why it has negative outcomes on the same groups is because of the top to bottom approach to education that doesn't always consider race and doesn't always consider the historical systemic racism that we exist in.
Amy.
So adding to all of that, my co-panelists have so eloquently said, I think absolutely our medical education and our structures that we have learned to live in and thrive or survive in have all been with whiteness as a center. But even further and a bigger context of that is our K-12 education has also been around the structure of whiteness. I didn't learn about residential schools when I was young. I mean, that was many, many years ago, but they're just starting to introduce that into curriculum. I have an 11-year-old and we're having these very difficult conversations where he's asking me, as a half Caucasian, half Chinese boy who looks like a mini Amy Tan, what color am I? Because my my Chinese friends are saying I don't look Chinese, and I definitely don't look white like my dad. But then also he looks at me and he says, why are we not having these really important conversations in school? Why are we not learning about this? And I didn't have an answer for him, who's about to go into 6th grade, as to why we're not. So, the notion, anti-racism, I think, firmly believe, starts at home, starts when you are a child, when looking at the books that you're reading to your children, through to K-12, and then into post-secondary and medical education. So we need to think about that. And I think for me, my personal journey there's been shame, there's been guilt. I bought into the model minority stereotype. As a daughter of immigrants, that was what was ingrained in me from day one. You keep your head down, you don't cause any trouble, you don't speak up, you defer and you be subservient, you work hard, and we will belong. And now I know that belonging has been conditional and has, unfortunately, and again, I'm shamed by this, it has been reinforcing racist structures. And so I think the important point that both Sarah and Emma were saying is, just because we belong to the BIPOC group does not mean we're immune to discrimination or acting on those discrimination thoughts that we have. But that means all of us in society have those, and it's not about being bad or good. It's about how do we actually learn every day to be anti-racist.
Sarah.
So when Emma and Amy were speaking there, I just wanted to clarify for the people listening that what we're talking about when we're talking about our medical education is centered on whiteness. What we're talking about, and I'm going to name it for you, that's structural racism. We also call that the hidden curriculum. So those are words familiar to you, I'm guessing. But racism, as you know, operates on a spectrum. So we have that systemic racism, structural racism, that's that hidden curriculum that's centered on whiteness. All of our systems are centered on that. Our justice system, our educational system, our healthcare system. And then the other thing that we're talking about in our own personal reflections about our interactions with others is that interpersonal racism, which is much easier to envision, I think, for most. The saddest aspect of racism is that internalized racism, and that's what Amy was referring to, that excellent article in the New England Journal of Medicine on racism in medicine, and that's that code switching. And in my world, we call that passing. So as a Indigenous woman, I can mostly pass as a white person, and there's been many times out of self-preservation that I've done that. And I'm on this journey, I'm on this anti-racism journey myself, to recognize that those moments that I didn't speak up when someone was being racist against Indigenous people, or I felt uncomfortable when someone said something about Indigenous people, and I code switched so I could fit and survive. And that does not feel good. That comes with shame and guilt of denying who I really am. And when we talked earlier this week, we all have experienced something quite similar. And that is this, to white people, you can't see that. It's invisible to white people. But if you start to look for it and reflect, you might begin to see it. And it's very powerful. It's like it's invisible power that's there as a result of our colonial history. And I'll let my other colleagues jump in. Thanks.
Emma.
I think it's a good context and a good preparatory context to steer the conversation towards what can we do about racism within medical education. And also what does systemic racism or institutionalized racism looks in the medical context as well. So we talked about, oh yes, everything is centered on whiteness. What does that actually look like? And I wanted to provide some examples. I recall in medical school, when we decided or we had contexts that brought up people of color, it always was directed towards something, a very genetic, specifically genetic disorder. Or if we talked about Indigenous people, it was plugged in within the plethora of lectures we had on all the different systems. So we had a small little lecture of 3 hours. I talked about the concept of the health disparities between the rest of Canadians and Indigenous peoples. So it always seemed as an afterthought. It didn't seem like it was a very genuine way to address systemic racism that impacted Indigenous peoples and the cause, and that caused such disparities in health outcomes. And it was the same thing if we mentioned someone that was Black who happened to be from Africa. Somewhere in there, it had to do with sickle cell disease, right? And we all know that typical example. Yeah. It couldn't be about something else. The rest of the general clinical presentation that involved patients had typically white sounding names, or for myself who went to school with Québécois or in Quebec, had Québécois sounding names, right? So it's all of these subtleties that are not explicitly showing to you that everything is centered towards whiteness, but by that hidden curriculum, we can definitely recognize that. So another thing that we often hear about is those unconscious bias training that we receive in medical school or in residency, those few hours where we realize that we are unconsciously biased. I think that it's time for us to move towards accountability. It is easy to say, I am not consciously biased. It makes us feel more comfortable. It makes us feel a bit better about ourselves that we're not doing this on purpose. But I am the first one that says I have biases, and I'm aware that I have biases. I may not be aware of all of them and all the nuances within them, but by being accountable, by saying I do have biases and they can cause harm and they can cause negative health outcomes, maybe we might take this a bit more seriously and not take anti-racism talk as a soft skill.
So I'm just going to pick up on that, Emma, and one of the things you said was, and I'm bringing it back to medical education. It gets me to think about, as we're thinking about the cases that we actually create, is that a step that we step back and say, hey, let's think about race and let's think about how we want our learners to reflect upon race in a particular case, or even when we're presenting, when a medical student is presenting to us and we say the typical, this is a 46-year-old and we name the race. Why are we naming the race? What does that evoke? And did we really need to say about the race? Or do we actually, is that an invitation to actually talk about bias and say it's okay that we talk about that? Just opening that up for you in terms of what your thoughts are on that.
We only name the race when we think it's relevant, right? We think it makes a difference in how we're going to approach a patient in these clinical contexts.
Amy?
I think that's the thing is that, having been medical educator for many years now, I think students and learners have actually learned to pick up, there must be something relevant, because it's actually not something that we do all the time. Like, this is a person from whatever background. And so when it is mentioned, they are zoning in on that and going, there has to be a reason. So let me think of a lecture where race was a risk factor. But in fact, it's actually racism that is a risk factor, not race. And we need to actually unpack that and have a conversation about it, because by saying a person is of a non-white background, it's actually, I would hope that it's an invitation to learn more about that person. And that's the essence of patient-centered care, is that none of us are monolithic. Just because I'm Chinese does not mean the next Chinese person next to me has had the same experience. Yep. And so it's really having that natural curiosity, which is really what we espouse as the principles of family medicine. But to not make assumptions, to not come in with, you must be Chinese, so therefore this, or you must be Indigenous, so therefore this. It's saying, acknowledging that different perspectives and different experiences have brought you to this interaction. How might that actually be affecting this interaction in the medical context?
Okay. Anybody else want to jump in there? Sarah?
Amy, I love that. I thank you for bringing this up, Ivy. I love the way you frame that. Like, it's not about race, it's about racism. And if we can include that in our assessment, under, the HPI, including race and how racism may have affected a patient, I think that's really an interesting way to look at it. Thank you for that. I'm certainly going to incorporate that into the work that I do in a humble way.
So there was a question on the. Great. So I'm going to go back, Amy. There was when we talked about it on Monday, because there was a couple of things on the chat about, how do you start this with conversation with a colleague, right? And you were sharing about how, something happened and you thought, I think that was racist, right? And you weren't sure, but and you were checking with some other of your colleagues. But could you just share that experience again and what that did for you and what that did for your other colleagues as well?
Yeah, so it was in January, and again, it was in the context of us being very concerned about what was happening in China and also in Italy with regards to COVID-19. And the Lunar New Year was coming up, and we got an email saying, for those of you of Chinese descent, if you are going to be celebrating with your people, to be concerned if you develop symptoms for the safety of your colleagues. And my initial reaction was like, whoa. But part of the lifelong reaction or lifelong experience is always trying to say to yourself that you're overreacting, that you're just being sensitive. And that's how I've learned to cope with these things, when really it is a form of gaslighting, and it is a form of again, centering it on whiteness. And the fact that I was disturbed by an email that I had nothing to do with, and was trying to make myself feel better is I think the very natural experience that many of us experience throughout our lives.
Right. And were you able to have a conversation with any of your colleagues about it afterwards?
Yes, I was. And it's interesting because I purposefully talked to people who were Asian and talked to people who were not Asian to be like, am I overreacting? And again, uncomfortable conversations to have is what I would say, because by going there and saying, hey, what was your reaction to this? And their a non-white person, an Asian person was like, yeah, I wasn't able to articulate that, but yeah, I kind of had this niggly feeling, and to be able to actually have an honest conversation about that versus somebody was like, yeah, it was probably poorly written, but it's fine. And then how do you reconcile that?
And Emma, you said initially we have to take accountability and responsibility, right? So in terms of thinking about that, if somebody says to, I felt that was sort of a racist comment, the notion of making the other person feel better versus saying, oh, I didn't realize that. I didn't know. Let me learn from that. There's about an accountability, and you talked a little bit about that on Monday. Could you share a little bit more on that?
Yeah, so, I kept revisiting our conversations, even as we didn't have any listeners in, on how we were trying to frame our message, which seemed to be more focused on making sure people were comfortable than actually addressing the issue. And I kept recircling and kind of bring this issue back to the table, because that's what we're used to do. We're making sure that, when I say white people, I say white people as a broader scheme, and I'm doing it right now, right? I feel like I have to justify myself when I say white people.
Yeah.
That we have to make sure we don't feel we're not making them feel uncomfortable or making them look like they're being mean. But we don't do that in medicine in general. When we present and we come up and we present a case, or we talk about a patient that has clear clinical signs of a specific condition, we just say it the way it is. We don't sugarcoat diabetes. We just say it's diabetes. So we have to change the culture that talking about racism is about the person who perpetrated racism. No matter how we describe it, maybe we say bias, we say microaggression, or microaggressions. Ultimately, it's just racism. And we have to be comfortable the same way we're able to say diabetes, to say this is racist. And then it's about the person who perpetrated that quote unquote offense to maybe ask more questions about why this is racist. Why should they frame their message a different way? It's not about the person who identified racism to make sure that the person who said something that was racist feels more comfortable about it. And if we're able to move forward towards this, we are going to be ready to make some significant changes. As long as we have to tiptoe around the fact that there is systemic racism and that we're perpetrators of racism, we're not going to move forward to try to dismantle it.
Okay. I've got Amy and Sarah. Sarah, I'm going to plug in for something that I was hoping that you could actually maybe share after I talk to Amy. It's about the systemic racism document that the college created, and I'm just feeling that I'm wondering if everybody has a bit of a definition about racism, right? So I want to also, just before we end today, just making sure that we do we have a common understanding related to that? So I'm going to park that for now, and then I got Amy and then Sarah. Amy.
Okay, so going back to what MA was saying, I think it's interesting because I think my story also illustrates that we're often asking for validation from people who don't experience the same type of racism to validate that we think something's racist. And I think inherent to that is if we can change that, that would be great. That we don't need somebody from the majority group to say, yes, that was racist. But at the same time, we know that in order for change to happen, we need people, we need allies to speak out and say, you know what, that was not appropriate. That what was just said was not appropriate. And to actually not, and so the emotional labor of us having to point it out in a meeting or in whatever organization we are in, the work can't fall on us because we actually don't have all the power to make the changes, let's be honest, which is part of systemic racism, but also it's a huge personal cost and an emotional cost to us to constantly be the ones pointing things out. And I have to say that the very rare times that I have been in the company of colleagues who are in a much more comfortable position to say, you know what, that was not appropriate, I have been so immensely grateful because then it meant that I didn't have to do it that one time.
Sarah.
Yeah, thanks, Amy and MA. When you're speaking, it reminded me of a time when I was a medical student on a pediatrics rotation, and we were at handover. And our senior resident was describing a patient of Indigenous background and made comments about the parents and their parenting skills and their education. And I remember feeling really uncomfortable, extremely uncomfortable. And when I talk about this situation, sometimes it brings up such strong emotions because I didn't say anything. I didn't challenge that resident. And we work in this power structure, right? This hierarchy. Who was I as a medical student to challenge my senior resident on what was clearly racism? And so the next day, one of my medical school colleagues, a white man, had said to me, "Hey, remember yesterday at handover when the resident said that? I think that was racism." And just by the fact that he said that to me and we could talk about it was so relieving to me. It really helped me. So when we talk about what we can do, and this is articulated in the systemic racism paper too, there's many things we can do. One is to hold each other account for when we see those racist comments. Because if people are like me, we're caring people, we want to be liked, we don't want to be racist. That if someone were to call me out and say, you know, what you said wasn't cool, and that's happened to me a couple times, not necessarily about race, but about other issues, I really appreciate that. You know, I don't want to inflict harm on anybody. And so that's always one thing we can do, is to hold each other to account. It doesn't have to be in a public setting. It can be afterwards. What we shouldn't do, though, is I hear our Indigenous medical students talk about their experience of racism in their medical schools. And what they're told to do when they bring it up is to go seek some guidance, to go see a counselor to talk about it. But we have to do more than that. We have to be, as a system, we have to be braver than that. We have to be more courageous and be anti-racist. So when a student comes to you and says, I experienced racism, you can lend an ear, but you also should be the voice for that person because they're powerless in that situation. It takes away your power. And so that's a way to challenge our system. And we need to have protections in place for people that want to bring things forward so they don't experience any retribution.
So,
Thanks.
Emmy, thank you, Sarah. So, Emmy, given that you're a resident right now, So, and thinking about what Sarah just said, what do you think for family medicine teachers and family medicine education? What are some of the concrete things that you think that we could do to demonstrate and being supportive of our learners if they come up with those situations?
Thank you so much for this question. I was hoping it would come up at one point. I think that we have to invest the time, we have to invest resources, including money, including knowledge, bring in expertise, so we can actually confirm that this is a priority in our teaching. What do I mean by that? If we have to talk about cardiology, if we have an academic half day about cardiology, we bring in a cardiologist, we pay the cardiologist to give us a lecture. I'm noticing a vibe or a trend within our medical education around the discussions around anti-racism that's requiring a lot of the learners to do the work. I'm really glad that CFPC had an article on systemic racism, but if you've noticed around, I've noticed the Black Medical Student Association at University of Calgary, University of Saskatchewan, University of Alberta, all coming up with calls to action within their own educational system, requiring the learners to do the work for anti-racism to actually be taken seriously and bringing practical approaches. It's amazing that they're doing that, but it's also a bit shameful that they have to do it. We have the resources, we have the knowledge. I wouldn't say specifically us, because me being a racialized person doesn't mean I'm an expert on race and on racism and on systemic racism. I have personal experiences, but that doesn't mean I'm an expert. There are experts that exist. There are scholars that exist. We have to invest the money to bring them in, to look at our systems, at our education system, and see where are the faults and where we can improve. This is what we have to do. We have to pay people. We cannot require medical students to come up with calls to actions. It's not appropriate. So I believe that if we take racism seriously, it's going to transpire as well in our can meds, in our professionalism points, where we have to prove that we are acting in a professional manner to actually graduate and to become a professional. It can't also be people saying that something racist happened to them and trying to find some counseling to them and having no consequences for the perpetrators of racism. And I'm not talking about punishing everyone around. It's not a punitive lens that I'm trying to bring to the table, but mostly an improvement lens. It's not about writing sorry letters. Sorry I said something that was rude. We have to name the racism, and we have to look at frameworks so these happen the less amount of times possible. That's the concept of having these discussions today. Because I still find that we're forcing learners to carry the brunt and the burden of having these discussions, and it's not appropriate.
So, Amy, you had written in your article with your colleague about practical tips of how to address microaggression, racism. Would you be able to share, one of the most poignant ones for you related to that, so we can get it to some practical tips? I'm noticing in the chat that people are looking for some practicalities.
Great. So I would say, honestly, back to basics and learn about the racist structures upon which Canada is built. That might sound really basic, but the fact of the matter is, and I can say this, when I was in grade 8 to 10 in my middle or junior high school, I was president of the diversity club. And now looking back, that doesn't do anything in terms of being anti-racist. That all it does is it puts a nice shiny veneer on the fact that there are people who are of different color, but it has nothing to do with belonging or inclusion or safety, which I now know better. And so I think it's very unfortunate that we are still having arguments through editorials and through politicians and social media that systemic racism exists in Canada. So my first thing is to start with, the Japanese internment during World War II, the Chinese head tax, how Canada was founded with Indigenous people, the the genocide that was happening, how Black people are incarcerated at higher rates in Canada. We need to actually know this and look at this and acknowledge it before we can actually say, okay, how do we actually work to make Canada better, rather than just saying, oh, well, you know, we're better than the United States or something like that, because that's not good enough anymore.
Sarah.
Thank you, Amy and MA, for being such great allies for Indigenous people. It means a lot when I hear non-Indigenous people recognize that our country is built on racism. For example, you know, the Indian Act is the only racist act, I think, around the world that exists right now. We have that. That affects our people. And just think about that. We have a legislation based on race. So, you know, if you're looking for tips, I totally agree. Take a hard look at what our country is built on. If you believe that problems are rooted in groups of people, in groups and certain races, that's racism. But when you start to look at that the problems exist in the power and policy, that's anti-racist. Maybe I sound really intelligent, but I actually stole that from How to Be an Anti-Racist, which is all of our favorite books.
The best book ever.
I just want to also say, my colleague, Dr. Marcia Anderson, tweeted this, wow, in 2017. She said, from now on, instead of vulnerable people, I'm going to use the phrase, people we oppress through policy choices and discourses of racial inferiority. It's a bit longer, but I think it will help us focus on where the problems actually lie. I love this. It really melds really well with that How to Be Anti-Racist. It's time for us to recognize that the problems are not in groups of people. So our government actually talked about the Indian problem. How are we going to solve the Indian problem? Well, that didn't turn out too well, did it? So Indigenous people, we've always known what we need to be well, what we need to do to be well. We know that. It was through the power structures of white colonialism that stripped us of the power to be well. And part of that we can see now, like look at Mother Earth. Mother Earth is calling out for a rest. And one of the COVID silver linings is that she's getting a rest. And the other COVID silver lining is that this has offered us an opportunity to reflect on what matters most to us. And I think we don't want to live in a racist society. That's what I hear. I'm hearing that, but the hard work is still ahead of us. So if you want a tip, next time you think about a patient and put them in a racial category and think that maybe their problem with alcohol or their problem with substances or depression is rooted in who they are, what race, which is an artificial construct, reflect on yourself and think about, it's not the race, it's the policies and the power that affect that person and the presentation that you see in front of you.
Oh, so powerful, Sarah. Emma, you want to jump in here?
Sorry about that. There's been a few questions on what can we do? What do we have to do? We have to be courageous. We have to be uncomfortable. I know that intellectually, we know what we have to do. How do we approach a conversation about race with our colleagues? We name it, we speak of it. There's no other ways, there's no detour to that unease. It's unfortunate, this is what has to be done. And I think we need, even though we already know that answer, we need to reflect on that fact that it's not going to be comfortable. It's not necessarily going to go smoothly. I recently had an experience with a preceptor of mine with a Black patient that had seen healthcare professional a few times in the last week. And I could see on our provincial system what thought around her diagnosis was. And I felt like it wasn't appropriate to all the clinical signs and symptoms that the patient was presenting. And I wanted to order some tests. I wanted to tease that out a little bit more. And my preceptor was asking me, why are you specifically ordering these tests? What are you trying to figure out? What are you trying to see? And I explained to my preceptor, trying to explain clinically what I was trying to do. And I left home, I came home, and I was very uncomfortable about what had happened. My answer should have been, I'm doing these tests because the patient is Black, not because of the genetic or the intrinsic things around that person's race, but mostly because I was concerned that the patient's concerns were not taken seriously. And I felt that it was my responsibility to tease that out a bit more. So the next day I saw the same preceptor, and I took my courage with both hands and I said that. And so you understand the power dynamics between a learner and a preceptor.
Yeah.
Saying that, yesterday I felt uncomfortable and I should have told you what I felt and I should have told you the truth. And the reason why I was trying to investigate more and teasing more of things that were peripheral to what we were looking at was because the patient was Black. And that opened the door to have a conversation. It could have gone a very, very bad way. And really, I shouldn't be put in a position where I have to jeopardize my emotional safety to have these conversations. But this is to give you an example of the amount of courage it may take you to have these conversations with your colleagues.
Thanks, Emmy. We've got about 9 minutes left, and I think that we're going to start closing the conversation, which is just the beginning, because I'd love to actually talk more, as we talked about on Monday. We just wanted to continue after the hour. I'm thinking about the starting the courageous conversation, because that's what we wanted to do. And for me, when we're working at the college, we're hearing that we want to do this, right? And this was an opportunity to do this in a really public way. But it is about, it's scary. It's scary to start, but you just need to start. And I think for me, what was important, being very vulnerable of knowing that, I'm going to make a lot of mistakes in this, but I needed to do this at least initially with people that I knew, people that I knew that if I made a mistake, that they would challenge me, not try to make me feel better, but to challenge me. And with that, I want to say thank you, because I think that's what we're trying to do. Is we're trying to challenge all of you, and thank you to all of you who are on this on the virtual chat right now, and have spent the hour with us. Thank you for that. There's one question that I want to end with that has come up. And it came from Jennifer Zering, so thank you, Jennifer. But I think it's culminated in a number of it. Is what would you say? How do you approach a conversation with people who say they don't believe in systemic racism exists? And for our family doc colleagues, any thoughts on that as we close?
Wow. Okay.
Oh boy.
It's very similar to speaking to someone who doesn't believe in vaccines. I'm sorry, is that okay that I said that? It's very difficult, and I can't wait for Amy and MA to answer this. But I have seen some people change. Sometimes it's a trip to Attawapiskat to see third world conditions. Sometimes it's cultural safety training. Sometimes it's a movie. Sometimes it's a book. People can change. They just have to see what's there. And in fact, this denial is self-preservation. This denial that people have is that defense mechanism that we see. So when we talk about white privilege, there's an automatic reflex that it's against me personally, right? Like, I did something wrong, but I know I didn't, so I deny. But really, when we talk about white privilege, we're talking about, again, the system that is centered on whiteness. And so when you see that, you can challenge it. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's a whole nother hour webinar to talk about how to invoke change. I'm
Well,
really looking forward to Amy and Ame.
and maybe if people want to have more of these conversations, put it in the chat so we can continue. So, Amy, I saw your hand up.
Yeah.
Yep.
So just actually leading right from there, I think, I think the instant reaction to saying, well, there's no systemic racism is perhaps, again, a defense mechanism to say, well, I haven't not struggled in my life, or everything I've accomplished is based on my merits. Absolutely. We're not saying that. We're just saying that race wasn't perhaps the reason that you had to struggle or overcome. Because I think part of talking about white privilege and privilege is that we also, as the four of us physicians, we all acknowledge we have privilege. We have privilege as physicians, and I think that's part of, and I'm not going to speak for my wonderful co-panelists, but for me, that's part of, I think, finally finding my voice in saying, I have that type of privilege. I might not have privilege in other spaces, like I'm not white, obviously, and I will never pass as white, but I can speak up. I can use the privileges that I do have to speak up for others who really don't feel, or they're not in their journey yet to speak up, and to speak up for others. So I think that is part of, I think, what we need to talk about. And going back to the systemic racism, I think it's, gently educating them, helping them get through defense mechanisms such that, again, learning about our Canadian history and how and why, like Sarah said, the Indian Act is still going strong. That is a very good example, but also tracing it back to its origins. And somehow we need to have politicians held to account for those who are denying it, because, sorry to get political, but that's part of perpetuating the problem.
Great. So, Emma, we've got 3 minutes left, so it's the last word to you on this element of it to close. And so fitting, because you are our learner on the panel. Although in a year from now you will no longer be a learner, you'll join the ranks of all of
I'm a lifelong learner. You know about that.
That's correct. That's
We're
correct.
all learning. We're all learning.
So your thoughts, Emma?
So my co-panelists are very kind and gentle, and I really respect that. I've moved away from that conversation a little while ago. I realized that if you don't believe that systemic racism exists, it's not my problem. And what I mean by that is that in the medical field, we pride ourselves of having intelligent, educated people in our field who believe in evidence. The evidence is already there. It's already been studied. It's already available. If you do not believe at this point that systemic racism is a thing, that it creates and perpetuates inequalities, that it causes negative health outcomes, it's because you do not want to. And I'm sorry to say that in a very blunt way, but I approach it the same way I would approach any other medical issue. If you do not believe that the diabetes is there, then I will direct you to read more on the topic. If you're interested in finding ways, like if you're interested in the evidence around systemic racism, that's a different conversation altogether. If you're looking for resources, it's a different conversation as well. I also encourage people not to be intellectually lazy and asking for others to find resources for them if they're able to find the information themselves. Because often I find that when people ask me to prove it, it's often because they want to debate the existence of systemic racism. So it's all about maybe my personal experiences about trying to prove my humanity to other individuals. So I don't do that anymore. I don't approach the topic that way because I do not want to betray myself. I focus on my wellness and I focus on respecting myself. If educated, intelligent, and resourceful people do not believe in the existence of systemic racism, it's because they do not want to.
Amy, thank you so much with that. I mean, kudos to that. We've got 15 seconds left, and I just want to thank you for this amazing conversation. Thank you, everybody who has been part of it today. We will summarize and try to get back to you with some of the thoughts, but thank you so much. Goodbye.
Bye.